This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. Cell phones in schools. It's a big problem for students and teachers. They can be a big distraction from learning and harmful to student mental health. The Connecticut State Board of Education is now strongly encouraging all school districts to install bell-to-bell cell phone restrictions, meaning no cell phone usage allowed throughout the entire school day. What does this look like in practice? School districts are on their own to figure out the logistics. Do cell phones stay in lockers or in backpacks? Or are they locked away in secure pouches and given back to the students at the end of the school day? Today, we're talking all things back to school, including the cell phone restrictions happening across the state. But up first, it's a confusing time at the pediatrician's office. The Trump administration has signed an executive order walking back some childhood vaccine recommendations. Joining us now to help us understand some of those vaccine recommendations is Dr. Melissa Held, infectious diseases physician at Connecticut Children's. She's also a professor of pediatric infectious diseases and senior associate dean of medical student education at UConn School of Medicine. Dr. Held, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. Good morning.
And so we were just talking about the executive order sort of walking back some of the vaccine recommendations. Can you tell us what does the EO actually say and how it differs from the current vaccine schedule?
Yeah, sure. So the executive order changes the framework for how childhood vaccines are recommended. So historically, vaccines were recommended universally when there was evidence that showed broad benefit to all children. So the new approach really places greater emphasis on parental choice and individualized decision making. So the executive order creates basically different categories of recommendations. So you have the vaccines that are recommended for all children. You have vaccines that are recommended for certain risk groups, and then vaccines that become part of what they're calling shared clinical decision making, so between families and providers. So this is really a major philosophical shift. So the question moves from what is recommended for all children to what can individual families choose after discussion with their provider. So it's a shift from population-based recommendations to more individualized decision making.
And what are you hearing and seeing from parents? Because I imagine these are conversations that you may have already been having with families over the years, but have you seen it shift in different ways now that this EO is out there?
Yeah, I imagine that the pediatricians in private offices are having more complicated conversations than I'm having as a more hospital-based specialist. But, I think the questions really are the same, but they're kind of coming a little bit more fast and furious. So parents are always asking, why are vaccines necessary? Why are they given at such a young age? Why do we give so many at a single visit? And I think the big question now becomes, can we delay? Should we delay? So, I don't think most parents are not anti-vaccine. I think right now they're really trying to sort through a tremendous amount of information and trying to make the best decisions they can for their children. And that's something that has not changed.
Well, and I wanted to build on that a little bit more because we have, as you mentioned, there's so much more information out there. We're a lot more exposed to them. So it can be overwhelming when you're getting all this information at once and you're dealing with your kids. So
right.
Are you seeing more vaccine hesitation or confusion on what to get when and where, hence the conversation that you're having with your doctors? And or sensing more frustration among parents because it can be hard to make decisions on what's right for your child?
Yeah, I think there's just more questions that are coming up. I think Connecticut is really great at maintaining a strong immunization requirement guideline in the state. So our immunization requirements are among the more strict in the U.S. But it really is all about how do the vaccines protect not only the individual child, but having high community rates that also protect our vulnerable patients, right? So our infants who can't get the vaccines yet, patients who are getting cancer treatments, patients who are immunocompromised. So it's really about spending time with your child's healthcare provider to get the answers you need. I think the bigger question that I've gotten lately is about the MMR vaccine because the executive order suggests that we should be doing the measles, mumps, rubella as separate vaccines, and that actually does not currently exist in the United States. And if you think about it, that's actually more vaccine visits. It's more actual individual vaccines. And there's a lot of very good, decades old evidence that giving these combination vaccines are effective and safe, and it reduces the number of visits you have. So, I think most of our questions that we've been getting are about some of the newer information coming out of Washington, some of which, like I said, the MMR as a separate dose vaccine doesn't actually exist right now here.
Well, and talking more about the MMR vaccine, just a little bit more context here. Want to note that Connecticut has one of the highest vaccination rates for kids across the U.S. So more than 98% of kindergartners have had the MMR vaccine. And again, that's measles, mumps, and rubella. And though there are several states, though, where the percentage is closer to 90 or the upper 80s. And in Idaho, for example, it's 75%. So can you point to anything in particular in Connecticut as to why the vaccination rate is so high here?
Yeah, I think it's a couple of things. We have a really great Department of Public Health. They work very closely with our school, the local departments of health, the schools themselves. We have an excellent immunization database, so we can really track who's behind on vaccines and work with local schools and local health departments to make sure that those students are up to date or on their way to getting up to date with immunizations. And I find that when everyone around you is vaccinating, right, we have very high immunization rates in Connecticut, it really becomes the norm. So the questions are still there, right? I mean, very highly educated families are still asking the questions, why do we need so many? Should we delay? Can we delay? What are the risks and benefits? Those are really important and normal questions to ask about vaccines. But really, we have the infrastructure, we have the dedication and connection to both the local and state health departments to allow for us to ensure that students who are behind can get caught up.
Well, we've talked a lot, I think, over the years in terms of community rates, and you mentioned just now. And
Mhm.
even with such high vaccination rates, kind of want to flip it a little bit in terms of talking about the impacts of what does it mean to overall public health in our state to have even just 2% of our kindergartners without the MMR vaccine?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, one of the things we always say is that infectious diseases know no borders. So, really, things are just a plane ride, plane ride away, or a Disney World ride away to getting exposed to some of these diseases. So, anytime an unvaccinated or undervaccinated individual travels to an area where they may be exposed to that infectious disease and then perhaps travels back, you may not even be symptomatic with the disease yet. And so you are really putting others at risk around you for contracting that disease. So that's really what it's all about. However, because our rates are so high in Connecticut, I imagine that the vast majority of those 2%, or really less than 2% in our state, are, I think, and probably hope that they were the medically necessary exemption. So we no longer have a religious exemption in Connecticut as of 2021, but the medical exemptions still exist. So those are going to be our infants, and our patients, as I said, who are immunocompromised or who truly cannot medically get the vaccine. And we are protecting those individuals by having such a high vaccine rate. That's what we call herd immunity.
And so you just mentioned that. So in Connecticut, we only have medical exemptions. Is that it? Is that correct?
That's right. There are some that have been grandfathered in if it was before 2021. And right now, as of 2021, we have only medical exemptions.
And you mentioned earlier, too, that there's a lot of questions out there on whether or not we can delay in vaccines because there are quite a few out there to get right. So I want to talk more about this idea of not outright declining vaccines, but just asking that vaccines either be spaced out or received later in life. Do we know much information about that? What can we do there?
Yeah, we do. And I think parents will talk about delaying vaccines because they want to get more information, they want to proceed a little bit more cautiously. But the primary concern is really that children remain vulnerable to those vaccine preventable diseases for that length of the delay. So, parents may delay because they, like I said, they want more time to gather information. They worry about multiple vaccines at a single visit. Um, and I think they probably feel like a slower schedule gives them a little bit more control and confidence. So I think it's certainly a potential advantage, and it could actually improve some of the vaccine rates among some of those hesitant families. But the evidence really shows us that the vaccine schedule was specifically designed around when children are most vulnerable to serious disease. So if you delay those vaccines, it means delaying protection for that. So, and especially those like measles, pertussis, pneumococcal disease, those infants and young children who are not yet able to get the vaccines can face the greatest risk of getting sick and complications.
Well, and as we navigate this with more questions and hopefully clarifying some confusions, are you seeing more cases of infectious diseases? What does that look like right now?
So I think we're very lucky in Connecticut. I think people assume because of what I do, I see all of these things all the time. And what I tell them is I see a lot of concerns for the diseases, but we've been pretty lucky in Connecticut again. We did have a case of measles in 2025. This was an unvaccinated child who had traveled internationally. And it was our first measles case in the state since I think it was 4 or 5 years. So there's a lot more concern. There's a lot more investigation. There's a lot more testing done because we are concerned nationally and globally for these infectious diseases to be occurring. Pertussis continues to circulate nationally. Periodically, that will show up in schools and communities. Meningococcal disease, although pretty uncommon, is rapidly life-threatening. So we worry about them, I think, all the time. I would definitely say we're worried about them a bit more, and people have a higher level of suspicion for patients coming in.
And so, for parents who may be confused about all the news surrounding vaccines, which is, as we stated today, that it is very understandable. There's a lot of information out there. So whether you're thinking about delaying or just need more questions or more answers to your questions, how do you recommend they go about having these conversations with their pediatrician? What are some questions that maybe they should keep in mind?
Yeah, that's another great question. So I think parents should be asking their providers, which vaccine schedule are they following? Is it the American Academy of Pediatrics, which I think probably all or nearly all of our pediatricians in the state are following the American Academy of Pediatrics vaccine schedule, which has not changed in many, many years. I do think having the question about the optional vaccines that the executive order discusses, those optional vaccine recommendations, having a really good in-depth conversation with your provider about why those are necessary is going to be really important. So, I think spending the time with your child's healthcare provider, asking, there's no dumb question. These are all parents and families who want to do the best for their child. And that's what I always remember. Even the hesitant families, it's because they want to do what's best for their child. I think we're really lucky that in our state, patients do identify their child's healthcare provider as a trusted source. And so having that visit, even maybe just to talk about vaccines before getting them is absolutely something they should be considering.
Dr. Melissa Held, infectious diseases physician at Connecticut Children's. Thank you so much, Dr. Held, for being with us today.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Coming up next, we head into the classroom and explore cell phone restrictions. Parents, do you want to see a cell phone ban in your school district? Email us at wherewelive@ctpublic.org. This is Where We Live. We'll be right back. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. So much of our world exists online these days. From economy and commerce to social connection, cell phones are a big part of our lives. But for students and young people, they can also be a big distraction and negatively affect their mental health. Could a cell phone ban in school be a potential solution to address these issues? As students across the state head back to school, we talk about how districts across Connecticut are managing technology use in and out of the classroom. Joining us now is Rachel Besharat Mann, who's an assistant professor at the Practice for Education Studies at Wesleyan University. Thank you so much for being with us, Rachel.
Thanks for having me.
And Teo Peg-Suzuki, who's an education reporter at the Connecticut Mirror. Teo, welcome back.
Good to be here.
And Jocelyn Delancey, who's the vice president of the Connecticut Education Association. Jocelyn, welcome back as well.
Good morning.
So, Teo, I want to start with you here. With the Connecticut State Board of Education has adopted new guidance regarding cell phones, and they're saying that it strongly recommends policies that restrict cell phone use throughout the school day. So, can you give us an idea of how did this all come about?
Yeah, so back at the start of the year during Governor Ned Lamont's State of the State speech, he really called for a bell-to-bell cell phone ban in the state's public schools. There was a bill that almost got to the end of the legislative process, and then on the final day of the session, it died in the Senate, as bills sometimes do. Nevertheless, both Lamont and other sort of legislative leaders have said they expect this to come back next year when the legislature reconvenes. In the meantime, you see the State Board of Education, which is a different government entity. It's not the legislature. It's sort of we're connected to the Department of Education in the state. But they're sort of nudging schools in the direction that we kind of expect the state to continue moving in, which is they're recommending a bell-to-bell ban. It's not a mandate, which the law would have been, but it is a recommendation that schools can adopt if they want.
Well, I guess you kind of answer half of the next question of how might this look different in school districts. So I think it's sort of a mix of wanting it to be a more one-size-fits-all versus letting the local school districts make those decisions. So is it the latter?
For now, school districts can still make the decision. I think the question is whether we expect this to become stronger once the legislature reconvenes. And certainly the governor and the co-chair of the Education Committee, Representative Jen Leeper, have signaled that they want to bring this back up.
And Jocelyn, so we want to note that even before this recent new state board guidance, that many schools across Connecticut have had bell-to-bell restrictions in place, especially for younger students. So restrictions in about 70% of elementary schools and middle schools and just about 30% of high schools. So can you tell us what cell phones in the classroom currently look like? Because this is certainly not a new conversation.
Yeah, so, I mean, it does look different depending on the community that you're in. But
Right.
Regardless, it is a distraction that educators across the state have had to battle in terms of fighting for student engagement, fighting for if students are following the rules, who intervenes, who's responsible for the discipline, and what does that look like, causing not just a disruption with attention and focus, but also some significant issues in culture and climate when it comes to being able to build a thriving community with your learners. And so having a bell-to-bell ban would, in fact, strengthen that our educators' ability to kind of teach with engagement and also remove that distraction. I find it interesting that the bell-to-bell bans are focused more on the younger learners because most of our younger learners don't even have access to cell phones. It was a big thing as a fifth grade teacher. They get it at the end of, fifth grade graduation or whatever, and then middle school and high school. It's disappointing that there are less bans in high schools than there are in our elementary schools, because that's really where the primary distraction comes from.
Well, I want to ask just how disruptive are these devices? Because I think we hear the word distraction a lot when it comes to cell phones. And just anecdotally, I hear from a lot of friends and colleagues who are in higher education, and just using them as an example where I hear a lot where they experience the moment they turn around to write on the blackboard or whatever board you're using, the students are back on their phones. And that's pretty amazing to hear that the moment their backs are turned, they reach for their phones. Is that something that's also happening in the grade schools and high school?
Grade school, not as much,
Okay.
right? Because I think you have a little bit more, I don't want to use the word control,
Sure.
but there's just a little bit more management that's
Right.
easier in a younger grade. I would say it's not even when your backs are turned. Sometimes that impulse to look at your phone. I mean, we have it as adults too.
Right.
I mean, I've done it in a meeting where I'm like, oh wait, I'm in a meeting. I got to put that away.
Right.
So I think that it's a distraction. We have kids who go to the bathroom and take their phone, even if there's not a bell-to-bell ban, where they just, have that need to be involved, whether it be the social media, whether it be texting a friend. Sometimes we have parents who call their children in the middle of the day. Sometimes they're ordering on food apps. I mean, there are so many different ways that these phones are causing disruptions and distractions. You can't really measure it in one single aspect.
Right. And what are you hearing from districts that don't have restrictions in place? Why are they not restricting or banning?
That's a conversation with the boards of education for why they wouldn't put in a strict policy. It's frustrating that the state board of ed had to put through a suggested bell-to-bell ban. We know that the removal is important and that it does something. So why a district wouldn't put that in place? I think access to kids, there is that issue of what happens if there's an emergency. But I think really it's messy to put the bell-to-bell ban in successfully. And I just think that some districts are hoping that they can do it differently.
Yeah, and so I'll just jump in and say, I did speak with some districts when the bill in the last session was up who do not have bell-to-bell bans. And I think one of the common refrains is they felt they wanted to give kids the opportunity to learn how to regulate their use of that technology, and they felt that they couldn't really do that if under a bell-to-bell ban. And I think that there was a bit of a division between sort of the administrative side of the school and the teacher side of the school, because in terms of administrators tended to feel a little more positively if they had some other kind of not bell-to-bell ban policy in place about how well it was working, whereas teachers tended to feel a little less positive about it, and that they were just spending a lot of time policing kids.
So I think a lot of what's missing from this conversation are the kids' voices in what's happening. Most of my work focuses on surveying, testing, interviewing kids, talking to them about how they feel, right? And I think a big thing that just came up about self-regulation, right? Schools are there to help kids learn to self-regulate. And I will say, Jocelyn, I'm coming from a teenager perspective. My work doesn't focus that much on the elementary students. And I wish that the phones didn't actually affect them at all. But we know that that's not true. So I have been delving a bit into that. But when you talk about cell phone bans with kids, about 4 out of 10 of them, teenage kids, support some form of restriction, right? Because they are screaming for some sort of guidance on regulation, because self-regulation develops kind of slowly over time, but executive function and organizing their behaviors, that has to be explicitly taught and supported. And we can teach that kind of in an amorphous way where we don't acknowledge that they're actually using cell phones outside, and this is not to say that they should be using it in classrooms. Of course, I believe that they don't need to be on their phones. As a teacher and educator myself, with college, more regulated kids, they still are touching their phones. And we don't know how to regulate ourselves. So who best to give this sort of support than the teachers, right, who are learning and going through it themselves? We never had that sort of discussion about it. So having these discussions early and often, it doesn't need to be while they're on the screens, but really infusing it into even the early childhood stuff. We spoke last time about, I worked with a elementary librarian who has these conversations. She does read-alouds with the kids. And during these read-alouds, she asks the kids, how do you feel when your mom's on the phone? Or how do you feel when you've been on your phone for a long time? To discuss media balance, right? So that these sort of nuggets start early, and then they can start building on it as they start to reach these phone milestones of graduation gifts and coming into school.
Well, we're definitely going to be talking more about sort of that interconnection of do we use phones in the classroom? I mean, do we embrace the technology? Because the technology, of course, is here to stay and it's been here for a while. But Jocelyn, I want to pick your brain here. Are you hearing any teachers integrating cell phones into their classroom in terms of learning?
So we've used the cell phones, if there's an absence of technology provided, excuse me, by the district. So we do know that teachers have used apps or different things to access different spaces. But I would argue that most of our educators, if we're using technology in the classroom, should be provided by the districts, especially in terms of being able to control access to, sites that maybe aren't appropriate for the schools. So we're not just talking about, the cell phone, but what else comes in the classroom with that cell phone.
Well, and Rachel, I think we talked about this last time we spoke about cell phone restrictions, because when you have restrictions, I feel like that can be, as Jocelyn mentioned earlier, that can be really messy because it really depends on the school district, the classroom, the person using the technology. So what are some overall broad thoughts you have about just cell phone restrictions in the classroom?
So I think my broadest thought that I have to recognize is that as a developmentalist, I think a lot about autonomy with kids and how teenagers, middle schoolers, teenagers, that gradual release of autonomy societally outside of technology has become so restricted for them, right? The academic competition, the extracurricular competition, the lack of sort of public spaces for them to hang in and explore each other, themselves, right? Understanding what they like, how communities work. All of that is so restricted today. And that's a societal thing. That's not just hey, we're doing this because of phones. That's pushed them to their phones, right? So while I don't think that the phone should be in the classrooms, right? Because they are a distraction, just like anything. Like why I said, you're not going to be watching a TV show on an iPad next to you. That sort of stuff is kind of self-explanatory. But giving them that ban that says you can't do that, to me, gives the kids the impression that we don't trust them, right? And I think that the more and more autonomy we can give them, and the illusion of autonomy, right? My children's school, they have the ban in terms of it has to be in the locker. If an administrator or a teacher sees it, it's gone until the parent comes to get it, right? And that has been working really, really well. And again, that doesn't work for everybody, and I don't have the perfect solution for this, but there is an acknowledgement that there's a lot of research that shows that what kids are doing out of school literacy-wise, like what they're reading, what they're doing, there's a mismatch in school, right? We saw this years ago with the graphic novel stuff, right? The kids wanted to use the graphic novels. The school didn't like it because they didn't feel it was real reading. And now we're seeing that lessen a bit, right? Just because you acknowledge that they're doing these things out of the classroom doesn't mean you have to teach with the cell phones in the classroom or have it so hands-on, right? It doesn't have to be replicated identically. It doesn't have to be on the device. Just acknowledge that, hey, we know this is what you're doing and this is what this looks like, right? And here's how, especially as technology progresses really quickly, when we talk about AI and the kids' over-reliance on AI as it becomes so readily available to them, we cannot put our heads in the sand about this. We have to kind of meet it head on and be like, this is what are the implications, and this is how we have to use it.
Well, and Jocelyn, earlier you mentioned there are things that we have to think about that's beyond just the cell phone. So we've been talking a lot about the fact that it can be very distracting. But is it also about the mental health issues that can establish because of the social media use? And, we're not here shading on the social media platform itself, but it is so prevalent and so overwhelming today.
There are we joke, my high school friends, we still have a group chat, and we joke about how, thank goodness, we survived before social media, because, there's just such a pressure and a record of everything that you do. So when you're thinking about high school in a time period where you are still growing, you're still learning, you're making your biggest mistakes, your most embarrassing moments, and it's all live and recorded forever. And I think that pressure and that lack of understanding of the consequence of that. We live with that all the time. As educators, we see what that does to our students in terms of the pressure to keep up, the pressure to be included, right? You know, if there's a party and people put it on social media, you weren't invited. What does that do? You know, there's so many different ways that kids can be vulnerable. And the social media aspect just heightens it to another level. And we can't control it as educators. We can't control the social media, but we can control the safe spaces we create in our buildings. And when we have that phone and the access to it, so it's not necessarily about the autonomy and not trusting kids. It's not trusting the other spaces. And so I think when we think about something like a phone that is actually an addictive substance at this point, we put restrictions on other addictive substances for students. You can't have cigarettes until you're a certain age. You can't drink alcohol until you're a certain age because there are consequences. And I don't think that phones are at that space. But how do we build parameters that allow for us to make them safer? And how do we ensure that the structure of the school day is different so that kids can be having the spaces to learn how to talk to each other, to problem solve, cope, investigate, discover, explore. The phones just hinder that at a level that we haven't seen in any other technology.
Well, and I love that sort of historical context in terms of the social media age is certainly a lot younger than smoking, for example. And so there's still a lot of time, I think, needed to, don't want to be too academic in terms of we have to study it, but we do have to study it. And Rachel, coming back to something that we've talked about previously today and beyond that, I think a lot of the frustration is that disconnect between adults and kids. And because I believe last time we also talked about there's this top-down approach. Is that something that you're still saying in terms of, from the adult perspective, not having a deeper understanding of how kids use social media?
Yeah. So yes and no. I do think that Jocelyn's concerns about social media are my concerns, and especially and I actually would say that it's more of I think it is a very addictive space. I think the cell phones themselves are very addictive. And what's really problematic about it is that it's nearly impossible to regulate the age. So you can age ban all you want. It's nearly impossible to keep those 11-year-olds off of social media. I've seen it happen with the most diligent parents, the most vigilant parents, right? It's happened to, I arguably am a very vigilant parent, as this is what I do for a living. And I've had, I'm skirting danger at all moments. And the safe spaces with the, bullying, cyberbullying is absolutely on the rise. That is something that we can't look away from. And so listening to kids about kind of what they need, I love the idea of safe spaces in school. I love the idea of them not having their phones just as sort of that addictive space. Like you get out of a room full of cigarette smoke, right, where you can just breathe and figure it out and also talk about why that is toxic for them, right? How are they talking in these spaces? What's happening? How does it make them feel, right? And that should be, I think, really part of it because that's what they're screaming for. And again, they do. I think that there's a big difference between an all-out ban and restrictions. And restrictions that make it look like I love the locker ban that my child's middle school has. And again, it's really working for her. She just happens to be a rule follower too. I'll let you know when number 2 goes in this year, who is not a rule follower at all. We'll see what she does. But the teachers need to be comfortable in the classroom, right? I've been in front of a classroom where kids are on their laptops. It's awful. The teachers need to be comfortable. The students need to feel respected. And everybody needs to be in an environment where there's an open air of discussion. So I do think that symbiotic relationship and hearing kids is important.
Well, and Teo, actually, I'm curious to hear from your experience reporting. Did you hear much about the age restriction or hearing from kids who are interested in what policies are being put in place?
Well, there's certainly a lot of interest from kids in terms of what policy is going to come in place. Generally speaking, most of the high school students, because when we talk about a bell-to-bell ban, that's sort of the population that's most going to be impacted by that. Most of the high school students I've spoken with are a little bit skeptical of a bell-to-bell ban. Interestingly, most of the high school students I've spoken with have also said they know of kids who struggle a lot with their phones, even though they themselves don't say that. And it tends to be kids who I think maybe were struggling anyway. And so the cell phone kind of exacerbates a pattern. That's a very general statement, but that's sort of the what I noticed when talking to various kids. I've spoken to a couple of high school students who do favor a bell-to-bell ban, who did kind of throw up their hands and say, you know what, this technology is just it's too strong to really expect us to manage on our own. So that whether that represents some changing attitudes or just the fact that I was talking to different kids at different times is hard to say.
Right. I mean, generalizing, of course. Jocelyn?
Yeah, I wanted to speak a little bit about the autonomy piece of this and district to district, because we have legislation on school climate that actually pairs really nicely with this conversation around cell phones that I'm not sure everybody pays attention to or realizes, but every building in every district is supposed to have a school climate committee. And they're supposed to have improvement plans, and it does comprise parents and unions and teachers, other teachers, other educators in the district, other stakeholders, and students. And so school climate committees could be having this conversation of, if we're talking about improving climate in our buildings, where do cell phones fall in this? And how do we want to build our bell-to-bell structure so that it meets the needs of our building community? I think what I like about the bell-to-bell understanding is that it would be a statewide understanding that cell phones don't have a place in our classrooms, that we don't have right now. And so we do have, good teacher, cool teacher who lets me have my cell phone and the one that doesn't, or, those different kind of extra burdens on this issue that we don't need to have if we just have a solid standard for what a good classroom should look like when it comes to the distractions.
Well, and Rachel, before we go to break, I do want to touch on this, where I'm sort of following this thread of conversation, realizing that we're talking a lot about banning a technology device from a classroom. That's very difficult because it sounds very case-by-case basis. But I feel like we're also talking about there's a need for third spaces for kids to just be. So can you talk more about what kind of needs are there to have these third spaces?
Yeah, so I mean, granted, cell phones are very attractive. There's a lot to do on them, right? It's an attention grabber. But I do think that this excessive use is a symptom of a larger issue that we're having with young kids. The mental health crisis is real. We need to address it. And often social media and phones get the blame, which they deserve, but not fully as the root cause. And I think, so my work is really looking into, I look at identity development, which is the key developmental task of adolescence, right? Middle school into high, that's all they're supposed to be doing is finding out who they are, right? So that they can have mental security going forward. And third spaces, these sort of not school, not home, these community spaces that are free, open, and, you kind of communicate norms, they learn how to act. Those are becoming not only more scarce, they're becoming so highly regulated and surveilled, right? The no loitering signs. The last vestige of this was the mall. And now no kids under 17 alone in the mall, right? Not that we were doing great things in the mall, but, it becomes a space where they can kind of enact societal norms, right? And their little hierarchies in the mall. They're dealing with shop owners. They're managing money. They're doing all this. We don't have those spaces anymore. So my current work is really kind of theorizing around that and what that looks like, in addition to the pressures that are placed on kids and the time scarcity that they have too because of these pressures. So I think that that's something that, and so cell phones then, they pushed here, they become a hiding space for them to kind of get away and enact these developmental needs in that space.
I wasn't expecting validation of going to Hot Topic as a way of managing my finances, so I love that point. Thanks for that. You've been listening to Rachel Besharat Mann, who's an assistant professor at the Practice for Education Studies at Wesleyan University, Teo Peg-Suzuki, education reporter at Connecticut Mirror, and Jocelyn Delancey, who is the vice president of the Connecticut Education Association. After a quick break, we'll touch on a few other education topics. This is Where We Live. Stay with us. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. We've been talking about the state of cell phones in schools here in Connecticut and whether or not it's time to get them out of the classroom. We're still going to be talking about that, but we're also going to touch on other education issues today. Teo, in addition to our conversations on cell phones, many school districts are also working on providing more mental health services for their students. What does that look like in different school districts?
You know, I think generally speaking, what schools are really focusing on is increasing the number of, well, it depends on which school district you're looking at, but increasing the number of social workers, counselors. In some of the sort of less well-resourced school districts, I'm not sure of the exact numbers, but you'll have one sort of professional in that space to a few hundred students. That, of course, is a topic that touches on school funding overall, which is a enormous conversation that we could probably spend an entire hour talking about. And that is something that potentially is going to be, I think, a topic of big discussion. Probably you're not going to see any big changes this school year in that regard, but in the coming legislative session, which starts in January, that's going to be something that the legislature is probably going to talk a lot about.
Well, and this is something I've mentioned before, where covering different school districts across the state for about 15 years, I'm still hearing the same issues today, where certain school districts are facing teacher shortages, social worker shortages, special education teacher shortages. So it's hard to fill certain types of positions. And what do we know about the state of teacher retention, and why are so many teachers leaving the profession?
That's probably a question that Jocelyn can answer better than I can. I'll just say that I think there's certain teacher roles that are harder to fill than others, and you mentioned special education in particular. So the state did recently just announce that it's starting this new paraeducator academy. Now, paraeducators are not sort of certified teachers, but they do play a really important role in classrooms, and particularly in special education, a lot of IEPs will call for example, a one-to-one paraeducator to work with a student, and that enables a student maybe with certain behavioral needs, for example, to stay in a general education classroom, which generally speaking is sort of the goal of a lot of special education. This new academy exists to provide free training to people who you don't have to have a college degree or an associate's degree. You can do this academy. It takes about 6 weeks, and then you take a test, and you can become a paraeducator. There's about 1,000, a little under that, I think, unfilled paraeducator positions in the state of Connecticut, and so that's one way the state's trying to fill that gap.
Well, Teo made eye contact with Jocelyn, so I'm going to tap Jocelyn here for any additional thoughts.
I will speak, I can't not speak about salary, right? That is something that we have to address, especially with our starting salaries here in Connecticut and the disparity between district to district, where you can, in some areas go from Bridgeport to just Westport or, a little farther south down to where I am in Darien and make significant more money, depending, not necessarily in the earlier parts of your career, but definitely at the end. But I would say for especially special education, we have to look at the day-to-day of what the life of a special educator looks like, as well as what the life of a special education student looks like. We've created these systems that are really heavy and academic focused. When we look at play-based learning, we have some legislation that requires it in our youngest grades. We're not seeing all districts following that legislation with fidelity. And so I think as we're looking to enhance teacher recruitment and retention, we have to look at what the day-to-day looks like, stronger leadership as well in our school districts. And these budget cuts continue to deflate morale when you look at, your colleague and you go, wait, I had 4 teachers on this team last year and they've decided that we only need 3. And our class size is now bigger. So I think we have to address those issues altogether, but there's not one thing that's going to lead to teacher recruitment and retention.
Well, and sort of back to the cell phone conversation real quick here, and especially with as we are moving forward, it's here to stay. We know it's here to stay, and a lot of people are interested in it in so many different directions. But one of them is a career. And so, Rachel, I'm curious to hear, because so many kids want a career in social media, and whatever that looks like is very different. And even if they don't, it's a tool, right, for different aspects of career paths today. So are we going to see more media literacy classes classes, classes on social media? As someone who went to, communication school, I'd be so curious to see what a class like that looks like. Big question, I know.
Well, because I do think that I preach a lot about the societal ills that are leading to this. And I think that every kid wants to be a YouTuber, right? Every kid wants to do this. And we have this sort of worship of these content creators, which the research on those sort of literacies and showing creation and expression, that can be super powerful for kids, right? In terms of having it be a class unto itself, right? I don't think we're going to see anything like that. And I'm not really sure. I'm going to be honest, I'm not really sure how I feel about it to begin with. I haven't thought a ton about it. But I do think that understanding what social media can do in terms of, enhancing an economics course or as they get older, should be acknowledged, right? Because that can have tremendous economic and also higher ability. If we're thinking about what is the purpose of schools, right? Which if I could answer that question, maybe I'd be running the world. But I think we have to prepare them for some sort of future. And I think we have, and the teacher, I just want to address kind of what Jocelyn was saying, we expect them to do, I was a high school teacher for years. We expect them to do so much. And now we're asking them to regulate phones. We're asking them to do all these things, right? When really what they should be focusing on is their expertise in how to educate, their developmental expertise. Kids need play. Kids need support. Kids need academic instruction. That's what they're there for.
Really quickly here.
Yeah, transferable skills.
Yeah.
Kids need transferable skills, and we need to be able to build curricula that's based on our professional judgment and our learning, what we know as educators. It is a science and an art. And so being able to have that autonomy in our classrooms and be able to build that structure so that we can have these transferable skills that kids can be successful outside of the academic aspect of this with those transferable skills.
I want to go about a minute here. Can you touch on the literacy aspect too, the media literacy aspect?
So literacy is being able to think critically about the subject or topic that you are focusing on. And so that's questioning, that's analyzing, that's collecting data and interviewing and building your own theories and ideas. And so if we don't have those skills, how are you building media literacy? And that's going to change. Media is changing every day so fast. What we used to trust and know or what we used to watch, now it's a 2-minute clip. I used to sit down and watch, the nightly news with my parents for 30 minutes it was. Now it's if I don't see it in 2 minutes, I'm not into it. So I think that the literacy piece of this is about how do you think, how do you engage, how do you question, how do you understand? And that should be able to be done, whether it's media, whether it's history, whether it's whatever space you're in. If kids know how to think and engage and question and analyze and come to conclusions, that's what they need to learn how to do. And they should be able to do that in whatever space that they're in.
Well, and Tail, you're actually doing all of that as an education reporter. What's up next to you or next for you? Big topics that you're following?
Well, I mentioned school funding before, but that really is the topic right now. There is a Blue Ribbon Commission, is what it's called, that is trying to kind of reimagine how this state does school funding in general. Their report's due on January 15th, and I'm watching every meeting to see how it goes.
Well, we'll be following up with you when you get that. You've been listening to Teo Pick-Suzuki, who's the education reporter at Connecticut Mirror. Teo, thank you so much for being with us today.
Great to be here.
And you also listening to Rachel Besharat Mann, who's an assistant professor at the Practice for Education Studies at Wesleyan University. Rachel, thanks for being back.
Thanks for having me.
And also Jocelyn Delancey, who's the vice president of the Connecticut Education Association. Jocelyn, always appreciate your time as well.
Thank you so much.
I'm Catherine Shen. Today's show is produced by Tess Terrible. Our technical producer is Dylan Reyes. Download Where We Live anytime on your favorite podcast app. And thank you all so much for listening.